Really good morning. I can't see you, which is really odd for me. I'm glad that you're there. I'm waving. If you do have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I'm going to pause at certain points during the talk, over the next sort of 45 minutes. So if you've got any questions that feel like they're related to something you just heard and you want to just ask it, drop them in the chat and I'll pause and try and pick them up as we go along. I'm Tim. I might have a small process and productivity consultancy that focuses on how the way we work impacts our well-being. That's called Make Work Work Better. And I'm here to talk to you today about ISO 45003, which is the international health and safety standard for psychosocial health and safety. But kind of why do we need it? And I'm going to talk a little bit about why this has come about and why we're focusing so much on well-being and mental health in the workplace at the moment. So, these are from these graphs you're looking at here are from the HSE website from the last couple of years. This is the last time they published their numbers around stress, anxiety, and depression. As you can see, stress, anxiety, and depression make up almost half of days lost. So days that the days that people have taken out of work. Almost half of those are down now to stress, anxiety, and depression. This has gone up massively over the last few years, as you can see by the line graph on the right. And it is now there's a few schools of thought, and partly is people have started reporting it a little bit more. So we should expect it to go up. Because people have started talking about it. But what's really interesting for me is just how much stress, anxiety, and depression have overtaken musculoskeletal injuries or problems as a key reason for lost days. And they are by far and away the fastest growing reason for us losing days in the workplace. So from just that very basic metric, we can see we've got an increasing problem. COVID obviously didn't help. But this was happening before COVID. We can see, you can see how it's starting to increase over time. And there's some other surveys that we can pull out here. I'm going to share a few more numbers with you. So we've got the over 2020, 2021, nearly 1 million workers were affected by work-related stress, anxiety, or depression. That's HSE figures again. And according to Business in the Community, we've got 41 employees who've experienced mental health symptoms caused or worsened by work. And again, the Business and Community in the bottom left, working hours have increased. So in that period, kind of immediately after COVID, working hours are increasing by 12.5 hours a week. I don't know if that rings true to a lot of you, but I know certainly that a big part of the switch to working from home, people tend to fill their commute a little bit, just starting earlier. So people have started to take on a little bit more work. We've got some other figures around how people are being impacted. So 37% of HR professionals are reported seeing an increase in stress-related absences. 76% believe their company should be doing more to protect the mental health of their workforce. And 41% of employees who experienced a mental health problem at work and reported it said that they'd seen changes happening in the workplace, but there haven't been changes happening in the workplace. So that means 60% of the time there were changes happening in the workplace, but that's still nearly half the time when people have had a mental health problem, there hadn't been any action taken as a result of it. And one of the changes that we're starting to notice actually is that there's this previously mental health issues had been sort of seen as something you bring to work with you. I think we're starting to recognise that actually work has a large part to play in people's mental health, workplace stress, anxiety, and depression. Now, those figures I showed you on the previous slide, it's worth pointing out, that's caused by work. That's not people with pre-existing mental health conditions who are taking time out of work because of those. So we're now at a point where we're starting to recognise that work has an impact on people's mental health, and that impact is having an impact on their ability to work. And it's something that we need to be starting to think about more as we're approaching the health and safety. We have duty to protect the health of our people, and mental health often doesn't get drawn into that conversation, which is kind of the point of us talking today. Now, Gallup's poll from 2018, so it's slightly pre-COVID, but a lot of this still stands, comes up with 5 top causes of stress at work, which I find really, really interesting, because they're unfair treatments at work, so perceived fairness at work, an unmanageable workload, lack of role clarity, so what do I do and what do you do? Where's the grey area in between? Are we comfortable with whose job's what? Lack of communication and support from the manager, and unreasonable time pressure. So you might think of that as like work pace, as alongside workload. Now, if you think about the way that we generally talk about mental health and well-being at work, we don't tend to think about these things as things that we're putting solutions in place for. So we think about, maybe we offer extra days off, or maybe there's a yoga thing that happens in the workplace, or potentially you've got mental health first aiders or an EAP or something like that. But none of those address what we're talking about here. So the top 5 causes of stress at work generally aren't built into well-being strategies. And there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that as we go through. But those are those top 5 causes of stress at work. How serious do you think that is? I mean, how serious do you think this whole problem is? I've got some great stats from a book called Dying for a Paycheck by Jeffrey Pfeffer. He's done a massive meta-analysis of work, studies about the impact on people's health from across various different industries. The book's quite US focused, deals a lot with the impact of not having healthcare as well, but it's really, really interesting as a more general picture as well. And what he did is he benchmarked the impact of those things that we've just talked about against secondary smoke exposure, which is a great benchmark, because it's something that we all recognize has an impact on our health. It's also something that governments have taken steps. Governments across the world have taken steps to avoid people being exposed to secondary smoke. So these charts show, based on Pfeffer's analysis of various different studies, how likely you are to have one of these effects. So in this case, it's a likelihood of poor self-reported physical health. And comparing that likelihood to secondary smoke exposure. So actually, if you've got work-life balance issues, if you're struggling to balance your commitments at home and your commitments at work, you are significantly more likely to have self-reported poor physical health than if you were exposed to secondary smoke. The same goes for fear of unemployment, so job insecurity or being unemployed. And actually, high job demands and low job control, so lack of autonomy and lack of control over your role, are actually very, very close, within a margin of error, to having the same impact on one's physical health as being exposed to secondary smoke. Thinking about mental health, it's a similar kind of picture. So work-life balance, you're almost twice as likely to report self-reported poor mental health from having poor work-life balance as you are for being exposed to secondary smoke. And unemployment, high job demands, and perceived unfairness at work are all higher than secondary smoke exposure in these studies. So there's real, but these are all self-reported. Okay, these are people saying that they don't feel well. So how much can we trust that? Well, this is the likelihood of being diagnosed by a doctor with a health condition. And as you can see, secondary smoke exposure actually drops down even further. So it's now below perceived unfairness, below high job demands, below the impact of shift work. We know that shift work has impacts on circadian rhythms and can lead to health conditions like heart disease and so on. And unemployment, all higher by these metrics than secondary smoke exposure. And then a lack of work social networks, so a lack of support of people at work, comes in at about the same level of the likelihood of a doctor diagnosing you with a health condition when you've been exposed to these factors. So we can see there's a genuine problem here. You know, we've got the statistics that are going through saying we're losing days. We're losing days of people's working time due to stress, anxiety, and depression at work. And the key causes of stress, anxiety, and depression at work are things that we can control as a business. We're able to control the amount of work we give someone. We're able to control the amount of the way we train our managers. We're able to control the deadlines that we give people. And they're actually having a significant impact on the health of our people. So this is where we're kind of coming to, and this is all this kind of story in the environment, if you like, that's leading up to the creation of ISO 45003. And just to kind of help you think about the way that we deal with mental health in the workplace, I talked about yoga and days off and mental health, first aid, and so on and so forth. If you think about it in this kind of 4-box, I love a 4-box. 4-box is like one of my favorite ways of like helping you people understand things. If you think about it, a 4-box from the line of prevention to recovery across the horizontal axis. So trying to stop things happening versus trying to help people recover from things. And then we think about the who we are expecting to take that step. So whether it's the individual or whether it's the organization, most workplace well-being happens in the bottom left. It happens in this kind of individual recovery area. So you are burnt out. Here is some support to help you deal with that burnout. So the emphasis is on you as the individual and the emphasis is on the recovery. And that's fine. And it's really important. And we're doing a good, most organizations are doing a good job of introducing those things. But we also need to be looking in the organizational preventative area. Because all of those things that we've talked about as being the key drivers of stress, so perceived unfairness at work and work pace and workload and ability of managers, they're all controlled by the organization. And if we can be more active in that area, then actually we create a much more balanced approach to well-being in our organization. And we're not just helping to sort of drag people out of a hole that we've put them in by the way that we've structured our working practices. Are there any questions so far in the chat, Suji, before I move on to the next section?
Yes, the first question is about the boundaries between personal responsibility of the individual and the employer responsibility for mental health. Where does that boundary lie?
Well, I would say that there is, like, we all have to take responsibility for our health. Like 100%. That's, I'm not questioning that at all. There is a responsibility for the organisation legally, and we'll talk about this when we get into it. And as risk management professionals, you know this, there is a legal requirement for organisations to protect the health of their employees. You know, as we all know, that is it just says health in the Health and Safety Act. It doesn't say mental health, but it also doesn't say musculoskeletal health or respiratory health or any of the other healths. It just says health. So organisations have a legal obligation to protect the health of their workers. The individuals also have a responsibility to look after their own mental health. Basically, if you have the boundary lies where you have responsibility. Okay, if you are as an organisation, if you have a team who are constantly working long hours and constantly showing signs of burnout, as an organisation, it's your responsibility to understand why and remove those risks, not just help them cope. If you think of it in terms of a physical environment, and we'll get into this in a minute. If you think of it in terms of a physical environment, you identify the risks and you mitigate those risks. That's all inherent in the work. So this is none of this is to say that we are removing the agency or the emphasis on the individual to take responsibility for their own well-being. We are starting to ask organisations to recognise that what they are asking people to do does have mental health impacts. There are things they can be doing about it, and often aren't, and that they should be treating those hazards in the same way that they treat physical hazards. Hopefully that answers the question. We'll get into it in a little bit more detail in a moment anyway. Was there anything else, Sue?
Not at the moment, no, thanks, Tim.
Right, we'll crack on. Just a bit of terminology for you before we move on, because these are two terms that get used, and they are very close in the way that they sound, and sometimes people get them confused. So I just want to kind of like clear them up. And there's a psychological safety and psychosocial risk. So psychological safety, they're very different. They're both very important, but they're different. And we're going to be focusing more on psychosocial risk today than we are on psychological safety. So psychological safety is when an employee feels that they can voice concerns, raise objections, and ask questions without fearing that it will result in negative consequences. Okay, so it's the ability to speak up. And that is, the safety there is about how safe I feel as an individual, not health and safety. It's not related to safety and health and safety. So we're not really going to be talking about psychological safety at all for the rest of this session. That said, psychological safety is incredibly important in order to breed a culture that will enable us to do what we're trying to do. Psychosocial risk is the one we are interested in for the rest of the day. So that's the term used when discussing potential hazards to mental health, whether they stem from the design of work, interpersonal interaction, or the working environment. And these are the risks we need to take into account from a health and safety perspective. So for the purpose of today, we're mainly going to be focusing on psychosocial risk, not psychological safety, but that's also important. Hopefully that's clear. And so this will get a little bit UK specific just for the moment, but it's just to give an idea of how these the legislation and the existing standards all fit together. So in the UK, we have the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, which says we must ensure, as far as reasonably practical, that the health, safety, and welfare of all employees. And as I just mentioned, that includes mental health. Okay, it's not explicit, but nothing else is either. So that includes mental health. And in 1999, we had the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations, which requires employees to carry out risk assessments, information, and training. And that also includes risk assessments for things that might pose psychosocial risks. Okay, so the protection of employees' mental health and the mitigation of psychosocial risk is already written into UK law. So this is not new, but it has been kind of ignored because, you know, mental health is unfortunately remained quite stigmatized, and you know, that's improving, but I think it's still there. People have historically felt less comfortable talking about it. It's a bit more squishy. So for all of these reasons, they've not really been considered, or by a lot of people, as being covered in health and safety. Because how do you health and safety mental health? ISO 45001 is the international standard for occupational health and safety management systems. So that came out in 2018, and that kind of gives you, there's an international standard framework for health and safety management systems, for the way that you record and manage risks in your organization. Most of you are probably familiar with ISO 45001, and that framework provides everything that an organization needs in order to have a best practice health and safety management approach, and a way of managing those, managing and mitigating risks. ISO 45003 is what we call a child standard of ISO 45001. You don't need to have ISO 45001 to look at ISO 45003. You can look at it entirely independently, but if you have ISO 45001, ISO 45003 will slot very nicely into your existing health and safety management systems. As a result of being a child standard and a guidance standard. So you can't be like accredited or certified to ISO 45003. There are organisations that will certify you, but it's not a standard in the same way that ISO 45003 is, that you can get accredited. You can get accredited to. As partly as a result of being a child standard, ISO 45003 is actually very readable, because all of the stuff about your health and safety management systems, about how you do your documentation, about all the approaches you make, about what risk assessment entails, most of that is covered in ISO 45001. So 45003 in and of itself is a document which mainly talks about what is psychosocial risk, how to manage a risk assessment, and breaks down into examples of the actual kind of things we're talking about. So as far as these things go, it's pretty readable. I am not the sort of person who ever a few years ago thought I would be reading a health and safety standard, and I was able to get through it quite happily. So it's not, if you're concerned about that level of detail, it's actually quite readable as these things go. So that's how we fit together anyway. So just to cover, it's from a familiarity point of view, child standard 45001. It's got a familiar management system, familiar risk assessment. The risk assessment will be very much like most risk management professionals are used to dealing with, and it is a guidance standard, but BSI and other bodies offer their own certification. Any more questions pop up as we've been going through that, Sue?
Yes, it's about actually measuring maintaining good mental health, and particularly within a workforce that is working remotely. So how, if you've got people that are working from home, say, or a majority of your workforce are working from home, how do you find out about their mental health, and how do you maintain good mental health when they're working away from the office?
So slightly different questions to what we're talking about today. So measuring mental health and well-being, there are lots of schools of thought on what's the best way of doing that. Employee perception surveys. There are things like the HSE have a kind of like a stress index that's based on their stress management standards that you can download and use there. There's the Copenhagen burnout questionnaires. There are various other questionnaires that you can use to measure the perception of an employee's self-perception of their mental health and take action against it and make work better. We have our own that we've devised in order to help with something similar. What we recommend from a point of view of ISO 45003 is, you think about it in health and safety terms, is identifying the risks. So you're not necessarily looking at measuring an individual's specific mental health. It's more about looking at what are the risks to that person's mental health that they encounter every day, and then putting in mitigation where necessary for those things. So slightly different questions, and both really important. What I would say is that you don't always get a full picture from the perception surveys, and actually a more robust, certainly from a risk management perspective, more robust approach would be to risk assess somebody's work in the same way that your remote workers, I imagine you've probably got something in place for, say, their desk assessments, in the same way that they would be have desk assessments at if they were in the office. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that remotely now, and you've probably done something along those lines to make sure that they are working in a way which is physically healthy. You can conduct a similar risk assessment based on psychosocial risk that would map to ISO 45003, which would enable you to ensure that you are mitigating potential risks to their mental health. Hopefully that answers the question. Anything else?
It does, yeah, that's it. Thank you, Tim.
Lovely. Okay, so let's look at it from health and safety perspective in a way that you might be more familiar with from a risk management perspective. So you're all presumably familiar with hierarchy risk reduction from the point of view of physical risk. So what we do here is we've got this hierarchy that says when we have a risk, ideally when we identify a risk, we want to remove or reduce the risk by eliminating the risk entirely or substituting it with something less risky. And then if we can't do that, then we need to reduce our exposure to risk, reduce the exposure of our people to risk. So you might think about this in terms of you work in a car factory and you're painting cars and the fumes are harmful. So can we stop painting the cars? We can stop painting the cars, that would solve the problem. We can't stop painting the cars. Okay, so that's not a possibility for us. We could paint the cars with something else. Maybe we could paint the cars with something less fumey, and maybe that'd work. Maybe we could stop there. Okay, maybe we find something magic that we can paint the cars with that isn't fumey and everyone's happy. Great. Maybe we can't though. Maybe actually painting the cars with something else doesn't completely remove the problem. It reduces it, but it doesn't completely remove it. So then we've got engineering controls. So engineering controls we generally describe as things which are changed either environmentally or in the systems that help to mitigate the risk. So in this case, we might improve the ventilation in the painting area. We might put some massive fans in to sort of suck the fumes out. Maybe that's too expensive, or maybe it's still not had the impact that we wanted to. So then we're into administrative controls. Now, administrative controls tend to think of things where you are expecting people to modify their behaviour to behave in a safer way. So they're less reliable than engineering controls because you can't always rely on people actually doing what you want them to do. So for example, employees will only work in the area for a maximum of 90 minutes at a time to reduce the risk. That control will last as long as it takes for a manager's for a team to be short-handed and the manager going, actually, can you do an extra 20 minutes in there because so and so's not turned up yet. So you're relying on people to play by the rules. And then finally, the big pointy bit at the end is the protective equipment. So employees are given breathing apparatus. So as you probably know more about this than I do because I don't really know very much about it at all. But as we go down the hierarchy of risk reduction, we are taking steps which are overall less effective and are as we go along not really removing or reducing the thing that is causing the risk, but reducing how much we are exposed to it. And that is necessary in many situations. So let's think about what that would look like from a point of view of psychosocial risk. Now I've changed a couple in here, as you can see. Elimination and substitution are the same, but to be really clear, elimination and substitution, for the most part, you aren't going to be able to eliminate or substitute a lot of psychosocial risk. There will be the odd ones, but for the most part, the bulk of your risk mitigation is going to fall into the lower part of the pyramid, the reducing exposure. And I made a couple of tweaks to the language here. So where we had engineering controls before, and as I say, engineering control. So if you remember, that was the fan with the cars being painted. It might be guards on a machine, something that stops a machine working if there's a potential someone might have put their hand in it. Banisters on the stairs, those kind of things that physically change the way that somebody has to behave or operate. And the language I tend to use in this area is work design. So designing the way that the work fits together in order that people have to work in a certain way. Administrative controls are administrative controls still. And then instead of personal protective equipment, I've got wellbeing interventions. Because frankly, most of the stuff that we do for wellbeing in organizations at the moment is the equivalent of protective equipment. It's the equivalent of gas masks. It's the thing that we do when we've accepted that our environment is harmful and therefore we need to do something for that individual to help them cope. And I'm perhaps putting that in sort of fairly extreme terms, but that's really what we're doing. If we're saying, okay, well, let's work through an example. The marketing team work long and stressful hours around campaign launches. Okay, so we've got a marketing team, and every time they do a campaign launch, they all end up working like crazy hours, and they're all like absolutely good for nothing at the end of it. And this seems to be happening fairly frequently. So, elimination. We could reduce the number of marketing campaigns. Okay, so we could actually do less marketing, and that would help, because then they'd be less stressed. It's possible, but not likely. Okay. We could simplify the marketing campaigns. We could stop doing the stressful stuff and like just stick to, advertising on the side of buses or something, and like not do the whole social piece where we have to interact with real people. Again, probably not going to happen. Yeah, there might be some things that we can do with the mix or the way to do it, but in reality, the amount of marketing and the way that we do the marketing probably needs to stay the way it is. So then we think about work design. So let's review our processes and systems. Maybe the way that the team is working is not optimal. I mean, how many of you can honestly say that the way that your team works is absolutely definitely optimal? There's no thing that really bothers you that's just harder than it needs to be. We've all got our own version of that thing. I worked with a client once, and she described that a lot of what she did in her team is superstition. She said, we do a lot of things, we don't know why we do them, but we think something bad will happen if we don't. Processes and systems in most organizations are quite opaque, and everybody has a point of view on how their job could work better. So review processes and systems. Maybe the marketing team systems are so old and complex that actually they spend most of their time fighting the computer rather than they do doing marketing. And potentially, you could second some admin resource into the team during those campaign launches just to spread the resource out a little bit. It's not going to solve the root cause of the problem, but it's going to provide a little bit of containment and just a little bit of slack around for the rest of the team. Administrative controls, so you can improve your team working practices and standards. So you could put in something like an agreement around what's an acceptable length of time before somebody responds to an email, or you could put in daily stand-up meetings to check on progress, or you could put in periods of time or you could agree you don't book a meeting over lunch, or you could agree that meetings all finish at 5 to the hour or 5 after the hour, so that people have time to go to the toilet and get a drink of water. Okay, these are all things that will help with the symptoms we're seeing and address some of the issues, but they do rely on people changing their behavior. They rely on people actually sticking to those standards. So they're going to be less effective than something which is a bit more set in stone. And finally, you could give them resilience training so they can learn to cope with it. And resilience training can be really, really helpful for teams who find themselves in a situation, need to bounce back, but they're only going to bounce back so many times. And resilience training without taking into account all of the rest of the stuff that could be causing them to be stressed isn't going to cut it, and it's not going to solve the problem, and you're not going to get to a place that's better in the long run. So hopefully that gives you a good example of how you can use the hierarchy of risk reduction as you would for physical risk to work through possible approaches to a psychosocial risk. Sue, are there any questions just resulting from that?
Yeah, there are on this. So somebody said that they really like the idea of this hierarchy model to help with the psychosocial risks, and they're asking whether you think it's a good idea to do it at a team level across all the teams in an organisation, or is it, if they're a small organisation, is it a good idea to start with individuals thinking about it?
I'd do it as a team probably initially. I mean, think about how you would approach it from a physical, from a physical health and safety perspective. You're always going to get, I think you're always going to get more in-depth and useful and creative input from a group of people. Maybe you'd want to get a group of people who do the same kind of job together, or a group of people who work in the same sort of physical area, or a group of people who work on similar tasks, those kind of things. Maybe it's a team who will work together and you can thrash that sort of stuff out with them. So I would say that I would focus it on teams initially, and then maybe ask individuals to step out. and continue it themselves. Asking individuals to start with tends to make it quite specific, and while specific is good, you don't want to start with the super specific. You want to start with the bigger picture, and you'll get that from the teams more readily.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question related to this is how often should any review of processes and systems, as well as sort of wellbeing checks, how often should we revisit this?
It depends. Sorry.
That's okay.
I would say that, well, so I mean, I'm a process improvement consultant. It's kind of my thing. So I would say that you review your processes as frequently as your measures suggest you need to review your processes. So if you have all of your processes should have some kind of measurement that tell you how well those processes are performing. Now, some of those processes will be your business KPIs. Or the things that feed into your business KPIs. If you want to learn more about this, come along to my meaningful measures session, which I'll be doing at some point in hopefully near future, where we go into this in great detail. But all processes will have an output. If you're measuring that output, you'll know if the process is working. If you monitor that measure, you'll know whether the process needs reviewing. So I wouldn't do it on a time basis. I'd be doing it on, is the process still fit for purpose? And by doing that, and and that measurement could be, actually, we want to be better at this. That measurement could be, right, we want it to be that for the marketing team, they never work more than 15% overtime around a campaign launch, and we measure that. And maybe we put in a new process and it works brilliantly for the first 2 months, and then something happens and suddenly we get like a couple of months of 18%, and then like maybe a month of 25%, and we start to see it slipping back down and go, right, so what's happened? And then we need to go back to that process review. So I wouldn't do it on a time basis, I would do it on a results basis. As for the wellbeing checks, we'll come on to this in a minute. Most businesses have got a cadence of employee engagement, and whatever you're doing with your employees, you want to make sure that you're tying into that cadence, because you don't want to get survey fatigue from your employees. Also, there's only any point asking people about something if you're going to try and change it, because if you ask it and you're not doing anything to change it, then they're going to be less engaged the next time you ask them. So I'll be tying all of that stuff together with activity that you're doing.
Yep, that's great, thank you.
Okay, right, so just in the last sort of 10 minutes or so, I just want to get into so ISO 45003 is broken into 3 areas. So sort of 3 pillars that which are how work is organised, interpersonal factors, and environment and hazardous tasks. I just want to cover these off quite quickly, so we've got time to cover some questions at the end. So how work is organised, that covers roles and expectations. Do you know what your job is? Do you know what good looks like? Do you know what their job is? Do you know what good looks like for them? Do you know how your role impacts them, and vice versa? Okay. Lack of clarity over roles is, as we saw earlier, is a high scores high on like as a cause of stress. Anecdotally, a lot of my experience with stress at work, and other people who I've worked with stress at work, a lot of their anxiety would come from, well, that person does a job that's a bit like mine. Why are they doing a job that's a bit like mine? I don't understand why they're doing that and I'm doing this. Does that mean I'm going to be fired? What if they're better at it than me? So actually understanding the roles and expectations from a human point of view, as well as an organizational efficiency point of view, really important. Job control or autonomy. Autonomy is a massive driver of job satisfaction and motivation. If we can't do a job in the way that we want to be able to do it, then we will find that job less rewarding. Obviously, not all jobs can be done. The level of autonomy we can give people will depend on the job role. But generally, we should give people as much autonomy as we can within the confines of that role. So when you think about job demands, so what does the job expect of people? How much of something do we expect from people in what kind of period of time? And into that, I would tie in workload and work rhythm and working hours. What are the things that we are expecting people to do realistic, and acceptable. Isolation, job security speak for themselves. We'll speak talk a little bit about change. Change comes out constantly in the work I do with clients as being a key driver of stress and anxiety in organisations. Poorly managed change. And I don't just mean like big organisational restructures, although include it, like changing where people sit, right, can be massively stressful for people, you know. Changing the way that somebody does their job, especially if they're somebody who's been working in the same way for a long time, can be really stressful. I'm not saying that change is bad. I realise that change needs to happen in order for organisations to remain current and relevant. But what I'm saying is if you don't manage that change well, it will be a source of psychosocial risk, and you need to recognise that in your change plans. Social factors. So in the bottom right on this slide, violence, harassment, bullying and victimisation. It obviously causes of stress, anxiety and depression at work, but it doesn't have to be that that extreme. So interpersonal relationships that somebody falls out with someone. I mean, I know we're not at school, but it does have an impact on people, you know. If you have good interpersonal relationships with people, then you will generally have better mental health. You know, you know, if you are able to talk to people, if you're able to ask people for help, if you have good relationships with your co-workers, you will feel more supported, and that is really, really helpful for mental health at work. Leadership is incredibly important, as is supervision and the capability of those people in supervisory or leadership roles. The fastest way to damage your culture is for a leader to say something in the wrong way, you know. So think also, you know, from a supervisory perspective, we often make people managers because they're good at something else. So thinking about, do the people who are in supervisory roles have the skills that they need to be able to do that in a compassionate and empathetic way. Other things in here, work-life balance, obviously, recognition, reward, hugely important. Do people feel like they have a path for career development? Do people feel supported? All of those are factors that should be brought into an ISO 45003 risk assessment. And finally, environment. So thinking about your work environment, you know, is the work environment something which is conducive to somebody's having good mental health? Do they have a reasonable amount of daylight, you know, the right amount of daylight? Do they have access to drinking water? Do they, you know, are they, all of those kind of things, are they able to feel included in their work environment? Do they have the right equipment for their roles? You know, does their computer work? Do they have good access to the internet? Are they able to do what they need to do with the less amount without like throwing something out the window? And finally, hazardous tasks is really interesting because you might think that this, well, what's that got to do with mental health? Because we deal with hazardous tasks when we do health and safety. You know, if something's dangerous, then we make sure we put all those guards around it. What we talk about here, from a point of view of ISO 45003 and psychosocial risks, as regard hazardous task, is the mental health impact of doing a job which is hazardous day in, day out. So, as well as making sure that the person who, you know, deals with radioactive waste in jars, is making sure that they are physically safe, are we also checking in on them from a psychosocial perspective? Are we making sure that they have the support that enables them to actually process the fact that if they make a mistake at work, they could kill thousands of people, for example? Okay, so there's a psychosocial impact part of that side of work as well. So quickly, I just want to talk about what's different. We talked a little bit about what's the same with ISO 45003. It'll slot nicely into your risk management systems, especially if you're ISO 45003 compliant, because it's the child standard. Risk assessments are very much the same. Not on risk assessments, I would think about your psychosocial risk assessment as being a bit like if you do a risk assessment for noise, okay? Because it's what's the severity, what's the likelihood of it happening, what's the duration that people are exposed to it for, you know? So if there's a thing that comes up that feels like it's a reasonably medium severity, medium severity risk, and it's, you know, quite likely, how long are people exposed to it? Because they're only exposed to it like for a short period of time, you know, once every couple of months, they'll probably, you know, that probably won't be too much of an issue for them. If it happens for weeks at a time, that's going to have an impact. days at a time, that's going to have an impact. So some people find that analogy of noise from a risk assessment for noise exposure a helpful comparison. But there are some things that are different about ISO 45003. To start with, we mentioned before the stigma and taboo around mental health. Okay, it's still a bit squishy. People don't like talking about it. It's getting better, but there is a stigma and taboo around it, and it is something that that isn't associated with physical risk, and a lot of risk management professionals haven't necessarily had to deal with previously. So it's worth thinking about, do the people who are going to be implementing this have those skills? And if not, who could you partner them with in order to help them build an understanding of what training they need in order to be able to build an understanding of how to approach mental health empathetically and compassionately. It's worth remembering, and this is a difference between the psychosocial health and physical health assessments, is that an individual will respond differently to a psychosocial risk or hazard in a way that they probably won't in a physical environment. So if somebody falls down a large flight of stairs, they are probably going to be injured regardless of who they are. To a greater or lesser extent, but there will be an injury involved. An individual working in a high pressure environment, one individual might absolutely thrive. They might be at that point in their life, and there might be that kind of personality who absolutely loves a high pressure sales role. And it's a great, and it's the perfect role for them. Somebody else might find that incredibly stressful. Or you could flip that around. There might be a role which has very little progression opportunity and is quite repetitive, and some might say boring. For some individuals, depending on where they are in their career and what it is they want to do and like what they have outside of work and so on, that might be perfect for them. So you have to recognize the context of the relation, the context of the organization, and the context of the individual will mean that not every risk is going to not every hazard is going to pose the same degree of risk to every individual. So it's a slightly different way of building your responses to mitigation. And finally, there is usually in most organizations somebody who already owns well-being. Often it's HR, sometimes there's a well-being department, sometimes it's internal comms or engagement, but there is usually someone who already owns well-being. And generally speaking, risk management teams haven't had to share the ownership of their area previously. So there is a piece there, and actually the bulk of the work that I do around this is helping to facilitate those conversations between risk management and existing wellbeing owners in order to try and get them, both of those groups understanding how each other can help them and enabling them to speak the same language. So worth considering that shared ownership is something that potentially you haven't had to deal with before when trying to do risk and safety management in your organisation. And that is me. Bang on the 10-2. Did any more questions come through, Sue?
Yeah, we've got a few more questions, Tim. Thanks ever so much. It's been a really wide-ranging session. So somebody stated that surely all this just boils down to improving and focusing discussion and communication with teams. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm not going to disagree because yes, like it's a key part of that. You're not going to achieve that without that, and communication is key to an awful lot of the. I don't think I've ever done a process improvement where communication didn't come up as one of the key things we needed to look at. I would say there's a little bit more to it than that. I think there's a cultural piece for organisations recognising that actually they do bear a responsibility for the mental health and the psychosocial hazards in their organisation, and that buying some fruit or doing some lunchtime yoga isn't going to cut it anymore. But also that those things, but also recognising that you can still do that in the context of like being a successful business and making a profit. None of the things that we're talking about doing that would improve mitigate psychosocial risk, improve mental health, probably none of those things are going to be things that are going to make it worse for your business. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's going to be the opposite. You're going to have, potentially more, slicker processes, better, more cohesive teams, happier people. All of those things are good for business. So, but there's a stumbling block for organisations at the moment. Is like, I don't understand why I need to care about well-being, and I think that's because well-being is kind of currently an extra layer of stuff that we do. That actually we need to deconstruct that thinking a little bit and take it right back down to the fact that how does the work fit together, and what risks are involved in that. But yes, communication is a massive part of it, absolutely.
Okay, and leading on from that then is how do you actually challenge thinking that some people may believe that psychosocial risks are irrelevant to overall safety?
Well, we've got a ton of stats to say they're not, to start with. What I would say is that's really interesting from this perspective is that risk and safety management, like, we're really good at addressing physical risks, particularly in the UK. If you look at the amount of physical injuries and deaths that have happened, at work, that's dropped massively, and days off due to physical injury has dropped massively. Days off due to mental health is increasing. Okay, so there's your number. The risk management professionals have a set of skills that are absolutely essential in reducing and turning that trend around. The ability to do risk assessment, the ability to identify risks, the ability to put in place mitigation and control measures. Risk management professionals have been making workplaces healthier and safer for years. And there's a whole new bit to go at here, right? Which isn't slip, trips and falls, and is actually the biggest drain on the economy from a sort of workplace perspective at the moment. So, if that was me, I'd be going, why do you not want to work on something really, really exciting that's going to make a huge difference? What's wrong with you? But that's me. I'm a bit like that.
So it's going in with the stats and saying to anybody that needs to be challenged, here are the statistics, and this is what we can do, and this is the bottom, this is